What's going on, everybody? Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and whatever time it is. Welcome back to another video with you, man, Measureaholic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another faction overview for the Divide at Impera mod for Total War Rome 2. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're looking at Parthia. This is probably my most requested faction to look into, and now today I am answering your requests. This is one of my most favorite factions in the game. I love playing as them. They have a very difficult start, a very interesting roster, and overall fascinating culture and history that I personally love learning about, and so hopefully you guys will enjoy this overview. If you have any questions, as always, post them down below. If you have any suggestions on what faction you would like to see next, post it down below. And anyway, let's jump on into it. So before we get into our campaign overview, let's start with our bonuses and buffs and debuffs that our nation receives. Since we are part of basically the Eastern Empires, or the Arzabam, I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation, but because we're part of this category, here are the two bonuses that we share with these other factions such as Haik or Armenia, Entropatkan, Pontus, and the Kartli. We have plus 15% ammunition for all missile units. Very helpful, quite a substantial increase. Definitely hinting at what kind of roster you're going to be dealing with. You also have the Persian Trade Heritage plus 10 wealth from all commerce buildings. Fairly substantial, not amazing, but not bad at all. Very akin to the history of these nations and how heavily dependent on trade they were, especially being basically in the heartlands of the Silk Road. So do keep that in mind. You will have a bonus for commerce buildings. No, it's not for trade itself, but for the buildings that help you increase your commerce in general. So do keep that in mind. It's not just for trade. Well, it's not even for trade. It's for the buildings themselves. But moving on to the specific Parthian buffs and debuffs, we have an increased experience for cavalry, which is always welcome. I believe it's just one extra experience, but I'm not entirely certain on that. I know for a fact when you start recruiting cav, though, they start with 2 experience, so it's either 1 or a 2 increase. But either way, it's helpful, and it does help you a lot playing as Parthia compared to these other nations, because Parthia is very heavy in its cav reliance. Furthermore, you also have the multiculturalism perk, which decreases foreign culture public order issues in general. This is a very multicultural region that you're going to be creating an empire in. So you need to be accepting of other cultures, and thankfully the Parthians understood that. Hence, once you take over a city or town region that has different culture to your own, you won't have to deal with as much public order issues as you would say if you were playing as Rome. However, you still will have them. It's decreased. It doesn't remove it. So don't get lazy, ladies and gentlemen. Try to convert the culture to your own over time if you can. However, keeping that in mind, you have this Zoroastrian slavery aversion debuff, which increases servile unrest, basically increasing slavery unrest in your provinces. So you might want to rethink your options when you win a battle. Maybe you don't want to enslave the enemy army that you just defeated and the troops that you captured from it. Be very wary of your slavery population. In general, it can actually get out of control quite quickly in campaigns in DEI. I've focused before on trying to take a lot of slaves, especially playing as like a Roman faction, and it caused me quite a lot of public unrest over a short amount of time once I won quite a few battles in rapid succession. So be careful of that. It can come back to bite you in the butt, but it's kind of up to you, because it's up to you how many slaves you receive. So do keep that in mind. Overall, your buffs and debuffs are pretty decent for the most part. You just need to be wary of what slaves you have, but beyond that, the bonuses you get are actually quite useful, and probably some of the better for factions out of all the other different faction groups that there are. Quite useful indeed. But anyway, that's it for the buffs and debuffs for Parthia. Now we're going to jump into part 1, the campaign overview. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the part 1 campaign overview for this video. As you can see, we do not have a lot to start with. Turning the UI on, we have the town of Nisa. It has a resource known as war horses, which you can look up for yourself, but it basically gives you buffs for your horses that you recruit. It'll also be a valuable trading resource in that they're quite rare in general. so it's actually not bad to have at all. But beyond that, though, you have a tiny little army here in Nice itself, and that's it. You have a spy outside, and that's it. One of, if not the single most smallest starting position in the entire campaign. Yeah, it's very, very small, which is funny because historically, Parthia becomes one of the largest empires for this time. But it is very unsuspecting, I guess one would say. But because of this, you are what I label a one-hitter quitter. If you basically fail your first battle or your first siege defense, you're out of the game. That's it. It's GG, it's over with. So basically, every single turn that you take is very intense until you get a second decent city. Now, I'm not saying taking Marv, which is a unwalled small settlement. I'm saying until you take like a large defendable city, such as over here at oh my goodness, we need to pronounce this. Hecatompylos. Okay, we'll go with that. Until you take Heka or perhaps Kaf to your north, you're going to be in a very precarious situation. So do keep that in mind. However, despite having such a small city, your population is actually quite decent. You have a population of 35,000 at the start, which is slightly above average. However, you have a recruitable population of the pagan, I would say, class of society or population class, which is your second lowest tier that you have, which basically is the peasants of your nation. Which might not sound amazing, however, you get quite good units from that section of your population. For example, you get your Dahe Riders and your Dahe Skirmisher Cav from that level of the population. So you have 24,000 people to recruit into these units, and these units are going to be basically your very reliant units, or your basically these units are going to make up the bulk of your cavalry in the early game. They're going to help you out a lot, and they're going to win you a lot of battles if you can use them correctly and use them in enough numbers. But despite having only the one city, your population class for the pagans and for your low tier units in general is actually quite good. You could fill quite a few armies from this. If you say go and invade like Marv to your east and you lose, you actually still have the chance to either come back and recover your losses, or to recruit a new army as quickly as possible. So it's not as terrible as it looks. However, you do have a very small elite population, with your Azadan, which is your most elite of the elite population classes, being only at 1,500. Basically means you'll be able to get a few high tier troops, such as these heavy Parthian cataphracts. You'll only be able to get a few of them. If you lose them, it's going to be hard to recover them, so do be careful with your elite tier units. But like these other mercenary troops belong to your bottom of society class, population class, obviously not including the foreigners class, which is at the very bottom. But natives, or I guess you could say citizens of your kingdom, make up a large portion of your armies, which is very helpful. So do keep that in mind. Unfortunately, you have a pretty poor economy at the start, which is expected. You have a small little settlement. You do have the warhorse resource here, which is quite rare, but it's also not really all that sought after in trade. Even if it were, though, you don't have many people you can trade with, because you don't have a coastal settlement at all. All you can do is trade with your neighbors here, your immediate neighbors, which is just 3. The Hareva to the east, Parthia to the south, and then Varazam, I'm going to say, because I'm not even going to try to pronounce that correctly, or these party factions to your north, or the party faction to your north. You can trade with those 3 factions. That's it. Very basic, not a lot of options in trade. So basically your economy is going to be suffering until you have a decent sized empire, which basically means you're going to have a poor economy until you're at the point where you're going to be doing very well anyway, so it doesn't matter as much. However, thankfully, a lot of your units have fairly low upkeep. For example, these Parthian horse archers are only at 99 in upkeep. That's not bad at all, considering they're horse archers, not even horse skirmishers, so they have quite a good range. These Parthian men-at-arms, they're some of your best infantry that you get, and they have a 168 upkeep. It is reflective in that their stats aren't really all that great, but their armor penetration is quite excellent at 13. Relatively excellent, I should say. But these are your best armor penetrating units for infantry, and like I said, their upkeep is only 168, so it's not bad at all, really. And your basic cavalry that you'll be recruiting to fulfill most of your armies is just over 100 in upkeep. They do cost a fair bit to recruit early on, like 1 grand for one of these skirmisher units is pretty heavy.
Our Lord needs
But
good
again,
fighters.
the upkeep is fairly low. So despite you having a small economy, you should be able to field at least one large army, probably a smaller secondary cavalry focused army in close proximity as well, if you play your cards right with your troops. Speaking of playing your cards right, let's look at your diplomacy. Despite you being in a very precarious situation, diplomatically, you're actually not that bad off. You only have one enemy that is in the red against you, or one faction that is in the red against you, or they're basically an enemy, which is the Scythians to your far north. They are a province away from you, so you do have one nation in between you and them. These two factions often go to war with each other, though, and I often find that it's the nomads that win over the Parthia faction here. So do beware of them, do not get lazy, and in fact you should be directing your early wars to securing this northern front, in my opinion. Generally I try to subdue the north, whether I occupy it or just make them a client state or liberate a military ally, which is not very reliable, especially in Rome 2 and DI in general. I don't really recommend liberating all that much unless you really don't care. But because it's quite crucial to protect your northern flank, I would say occupy this province here. But yeah, they're your only enemy basically at the start of the game. Even though you're not at war with them, you have no real relations with anybody at the start. Furthermore, neighbors who are a little bit closer to you are all pretty much friendly towards you. However, do not let this be deceptive, because a lot of these factions are actually allies, and that they are satrapies of the Seleucids. And the Seleucids you actually don't even know. You can't even do any diplomatic relations with them. So it's not like you can get a non-aggression pact with their masters early on, unless you send a unit, like a spy or whatever, further west to discover the Seleucids, which is definitely a suggestion that I would recommend to you. But a lot of these factions here, for example, Parthia, this one down here, these guys, they are all basically allies because they're all satrapies of the Seleucids. So if you declare war on one, you're declaring war on all of them, including the Seleucids, including all of the Seleucid satrapies in the west as well. Yeah, despite them being all friendly with you, it doesn't mean that you can pick them apart one by one. It basically just means that you can use this to buy time until you get the famous Seleucid rebellion that happens. Basically, not long after this time period, the satrapies that were under the influence of the Seleucids rebelled en masse, and that is reflected in the grand campaign of Divided Impera. The Seleucids will get a rebellion script that will fire usually within the first 20 to 30 turns. It can be a little bit longer, sometimes up to 50. But basically, it means that the majority of factions in the east over here will rebel and start fighting the Seleucids who are in the west. It does not mean all of them will revolt. And when they do secede away from the Seleucids, I would highly recommend you do your research. Figure out exactly what factions here are fighting the Seleucids. Did they enter their own alliance with each other to fight the Seleucids, or are they all independent? Be very, very careful on who you declare war on once you deal with your northern neighbors, which is generally my first recommendation for this campaign. Come up here, take this small province, however you want to do it. Draw their enemies out of their cities. This is a large city here at Cath. It's not going to be easy for your army to take, so draw their troops out. Use your better cavalry to deal with them. But yeah, this is a very interesting campaign. You have so many different aspects you need to take into account. For example, even if you declare war on these guys up here and you try to rush them, you can't assault their city quickly because you're a cav heavy faction. So you need to draw their troops out. So this campaign requires quite a lot of cunning to do this correctly. And not only, like, say if you're rushing these guys, you need to be careful that no one comes in and snipes your settlement of Nisa here. I've had that happen quite a lot. I'll go up, try to attack Cav. Quite often I'll actually lose a battle, and then while I'm up there campaigning in the north, my neighbors down here, for whatever reason, will end up declaring war on me and taking Nisa and stabbing me in the back. So you gotta be really careful of how you play this and on your timing in general. But we'll get into difficulty a little bit later on, but that's basically my early recommendations for the campaign. But yeah, you have a very difficult start in the early campaign. I'll talk a little bit more about the difficulty at the end of the video though, in my part 3 verdict, so stick around for that and we'll get into it a little bit more in depth. But for now, we're going to part 2 of this video, where we're going to talk about the military of the Parthians. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the part 2 of this faction overview video, where we are looking at the Parthian military. Ladies and gentlemen, we're starting off with one of the many General's Bodyguard units that is available to the Parthians. I am just going to showcase this one to you because it kind of says the entirety of the General's Bodyguard units in one unit, and that they're basically shock cavalry with skirmisher capabilities.
Horse archers!
As that gentleman just said, they're actually a horse archer unit. They're not just, well, they're not a javelin skirmisher unit. So they're actually quite useful. They have a range of 170, which is definitely nothing to scoff at. It's actually quite a good range for a cav unit. But their real use comes in that charge bonus of 54. And this is your basic general unit. They're basically all uphill from here. I tried to get the most low tier general that I could. Believe this is it. And the charge bonus of 54 to start your campaign off. Woo! Oh man, you're gonna get some juicy rear charges with this unit. It's very impressive indeed. Excellent unit all around. Armor of 38, base morale of 46, which is decent, not amazing, but pretty decent. Weapon damage 29, ammunition of 15, which is not bad. Melee attack of 11, okay. Melee defense of 4 though, so this is definitely a shock General's Bodyguard unit. You're not wanting them to stay in an extended melee. They will die not too quickly because they have a very high amount of armor, but they're not going to get all that many kills after they've completed their charge. So get them in, get them back out, and get them back in again. Just keep recycling them as you will for the majority of your cavalry as Parthia. You're basically professional recyclers, or Hamel and Anvilers, I guess. Basically, charge them in, get them out as quickly as you can. Very useful, very versatile General's Bodyguard unit to get you started. Now, before we move on to the rest of the roster, which you can see is massive, we're going to look at the skirmishers. We're doing things a little bit different this time. We usually go general then melee, but we're going to skirmishers first.
Persian archers!
I'm going to try and gloss over a lot of these units and do a very brief summary of them because there is just so many. As you can see, it's an insane amount of units, and quite a few of them are similar and fulfill different roles but just to different levels. So I'm going to be fairly basic about it. For example, this Persian archer unit is the most basic of archer units that you get. They are Persian though, they are not Parthian specifically, and the Persian units generally are better when it comes to using archery and whatnot to your advantage. So they're quite a decent basic starting position. However, they have no armor at all, so you're going to need to be careful with this unit when you're going up against other skirmish units, especially slingers. They'll die very quickly. But this is basically the bottom of the archer pool for you.
Archers!
Then we jump up to the Parthian foot archers, which are basically the same as that unit I just showed you there. In this case, the Parthians are slightly better, but only just barely. It's almost not even worth mentioning that they're better, but they are slightly better. But we will get to the higher tier Persian and Parthian archers in just a moment. Before we do though, actually no, I do have it lined up right here. We'll skip this unit, we'll come back to it.
Slingers!
I just still want to highlight that you do have slingers available to you, but it is just this one basic Eastern slinger unit. Beyond that, you don't really have slingers available to you unless they're mercenaries or AOR units. So don't use them. I just really don't recommend using slingers for this faction. In general, I personally don't like slingers anyway. But if you do like using them, don't rely on these to fulfill your slinger role. Get mercenaries, get ones that are better, especially once you get to the Mediterranean. Get some Rhodian slingers, things like that. Rely on them instead. These are very terrible. However,
Persian archers!
ooh, Persian elite archers, or elite Persian archers, I should say. In my opinion, and from what I've seen, I may be incorrect in this, but from what I've seen, this may be the single best archer unit in the game, possibly rivaled by Syrian mercenary heavy archers. But these are fantastic. They have a missile damage of 18, which is instantly equal to a Cretan archer. However, they have a range of 185, which is very long, definitely much larger than what the Cretan archers get. They're pretty fantastic. They have an armor of 20, which is actually quite good. They will survive for a short time against enemy slingers, although not an insane amount of time, so do be careful. Over a long period of time, they will start to die off. And they do have some spears here, as you can see, to help them deal with enemy cavalry charges, but they don't have a charge bonus, like a expert charge defense bonus, I should say. So if they get charged, they're still going to take some casualties, but they have a melee attack of 7, defense of 10. So they're not all that bad. They're not going to die instantly once they're in an extended melee, but definitely don't rely on them to fulfill a melee infantry's role. The spear is just to defend themselves. And then just up here a little bit further, we're getting into other contenders for being some of the best archer units. You have these Mardian archers, which are basically a step up from your basic tier archers. Not going to go into them. Basically slightly better than your lower tier archers. Use them when you can. However, here,
For the king!
these units look incredibly insane. They have an armor of 35. These are your Parthian foot archers, the elite ones. However, the missile damage is only at 16, which is 2 less than the Persian elite archers. So you're going to have to figure out if you want to kill the enemy faster or if you want your archers to last longer. And just looking very quickly, they have an ammunition of 15. And then let's look at the Persian elite archers.
Archers!
Same amount of ammunition,
Archers!
but these guys also have 10 less range than the Persians. So basically, if you want your archers to last longer, rely on the Parthian heavy archers, or elite archers I should say. But they're not going to get as many kills as quickly as the Persians will, so it's a bit of a hard balance. I would probably go with the Persians, to be honest. But these guys have a melee attack of 7, defense of 10. They will survive for a while, and they have an armor penetration of 12. I believe that it's talking about their melee weapon, but I'm not entirely certain. They are only equipped with a sword though, not an axe, so yeah, I'll be wary of that armor penetration. I wouldn't trust it. But very fantastic looking unit. Like, wow, that looks very incredible. I love it. Very good unit, but I would rely more so on the Persians than the Parthian elite archers. To be honest, that's just my opinion.
Javelin men!
And then here is your basic javelin skirmisher unit, which is almost irrelevant and not worth talking about. Anyway, moving on to the rest of our infantry. Over here we have our spear infantry.
Spears ready!
Speaking of irrelevant, this is your levy spearmen, the most irrelevant of the irrelevant. Only recruit these if you want them to be meat shields or if you just need numbers to dissuade enemy armies from attacking your settlements. They're garrison troops basically, don't rely on them for anything other than that.
Pike infantry ready!
However, here is your Parthian heavy infantry or your heavy hoplites. They have an armor of 41 and a defense of 18. They're going to stay alive for quite a long time, especially if they don't get recharged. So they're going to be very good at holding the line for you. When you can recruit these guys, they can fulfill your main battle line role for the majority of encounters. However, they are just a hoplite unit. They're not a pike unit, so they will suffer against the most basic and low-tier pikemen units that you'll go up against when you start fighting the Hellenic faction. So be careful. But they are basically as heavy as your infantry go. So it's going to be hard to fill the full army of these guys to fulfill your main battle line role. But if you can afford it, get them. They will be helpful in holding, say, like Roman legionaries in place while your cavalry does their work. And then moving up to the next in the line, we run into the Persian hoplites. These are going to be quite cheap because they're very low tier. They're the most basic hoplite that you can get. They do have an armor 28 though, defensive 16, which isn't great. But they do have a bonus versus cavalry and elephants, as does the other hoplite unit, by the way. So these guys use their phalanx formation. They will hold the line against enemy units for quite a while. But they will be susceptible to skirmisher fire and rear charges. So give them a lot of support. But these guys will be your main battle line troops once you can recruit them, which will be once you probably get your second city and you build the appropriate military building. Okay, and then we come to your Babylonian heavy spearmen, which is basically Babylonian hoplites. They are almost the exact same as the heavy hoplite unit we just talked about, except they have slightly worse, what was it? It was morale and armor. Beyond that, they have the exact same statistics, so if you can't afford the heavier version of these guys, just get this unit instead. They're slight decrease in stats compared to your very elite hoplites you have access to isn't a deal breaker. They have the phalanx ability, of course, so they will hold the line for quite a while. They still have an armor of 35, which is quite good. Yeah, they're going to do well against most hoplite nations. However, the more specialized Greeks, such as Spartans, will break through them eventually with their own hoplites. And of course, pikemen generally almost always beat hoplites from the front at least, so do keep that in mind. But yeah, these are basically your frontline units that you're going to be relying on to fulfill your infantry roles. Okay, and now we move on to the enemy swordsmen. Here we have your Parthian axemen. They are very, very low tier. However, they are one of your few early infantry units that have access to armor penetration. So if you're going up against Bactria or the Seleucids and you're struggling to kill their heavy infantry, these guys will be the flanking units to do the job. And they have ammunition of 1 javelin. So try to use that wisely as well to help their charge, which is going to be needed because their charge is only at 21. Melee attack is only of 7, defensive 7. Pretty poor unit all around. If they attack most units from the front, they will lose, unless it's a hoplite unit perhaps. But then they're going to take quite a while to kill it anyway, so use these purely just as flanking troops. Don't rely on them for important missions. Moving on from that,
Ready and waiting.
we have a combination of Parthian and Greek culture in the Partho-Hellenic infantry. These are basically your Furios swordsmen as Parthia. They are more of a support role though. They don't really have any formation ability at all. They do have discipline though, so they will hold the line if you want to try to make a front line out of them. I don't recommend it though. In general, I find the Furios style swordsmen to be pretty lackluster in holding the line. I would use these more as specialized troops for going up against enemy hoplites because swords and axes beat spear, at least short spears. Don't send them up against pikemen. And these will help you take walled settlements, which you really need all the help you can get in because you lack infantry. In case you didn't figure it out by now, you have very little. Right here we only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 melee units for your entire roster, not including AOR mercenary units. But yeah, basically Furios swordsmen for the Parthians in a nutshell. Moving on to our third melee faction here. We have some very basic hillman units. These are basically the levies of your fighting troops, of your sword and axeman troops. Which one of these though? Are these swords or axes? They do a combination. They're armed with spears, axes, and shields, and they are fierce warriors apparently. But they have a melee attack of 5, defensive 6. Almost really nothing that's useful except their armor penetration is at 11. And they do have a bonus against elephants at 5, but that's almost negligible. Very poor morale. Basically, charge them into the rear of hoplites if you want them to get kills. Otherwise, these are just going to be meat shield units for you. Not all that useful, but they are going to be pretty cheap. And they will have a lot of men in each unit, so use them to charge into the rear of enemy early tier hoplites. However,
Infantry at your command.
why do that when you have the Parthian men-at-arms? They are a smaller unit though, but they have an armor penetration of 13, melee attack of 9, defensive 8, charge bonus of 24, which isn't all that bad. Weapon damage of 18, which is pretty average. These guys are equipped with axes, I believe. It doesn't say in their description, but I believe they use axes after they throw their javelins. Either way, they have armor penetration, which is the bottom line, and they're quite a reliable infantry unit. I don't think you'll be using these to fulfill your basic frontline role though. They're a little bit more specialized into just trying to kill enemy heavy units. Even though they don't have an amazing charge bonus, these are basically your shock troops that you get for infantry. They look fantastic though, and they certainly have a place on your roster, but I just don't think you'll be using them to really turn the tide of battle in such a massive way. And it is helpful that they're armor penetrating, but then your other out of your other 3 units over here, 2 of them have decent armor penetration anyway. So it might not even be worth getting this unit when you could get 2 or 3 of his cheaper units instead. But their melee attack is abysmal. But then these units only have a melee attack of 9, which isn't really all that great. So yeah, it's going to take them a while to get those kills on the heavy armored units. But anyway, that's it for the infantry department of this. Now we get on to the very long cavalry section of this video. First off though,
Cavalry!
I singled this unit out on its own, even though it's a medium cav unit, and I said I wasn't going to use any AUR units. I'm going to make an exception here because this is kind of your basic anti-cavalry unit. Even though they don't have a bonus against cavalry, this is basically as close as you get to getting a dedicated melee unit for cavalry. You actually don't really have any cav units that are just dedicated purely to be melee. The ones that are shock units, so I wouldn't even call them melee melee cav. Melee cavalry to me fits that mid-tier role where they're mainly designed to interact with other cavalry units. So these guys are going to be helping out your other more specialized cavalry units. Quite useful overall, not too expensive, decent armor of 38, so they will survive against enemy slingers and whatnot. Melee attack of 10, defensive 8. Try to give them support if you can in your spearmen coming in to try and help them out, especially a trashy levy spearman. But yeah, basically use these to support your more specialized units. But that's it for that one little section there. Now we're getting on to purely skirmisher specialized and more here.
Ready!
First off, let's start with this unit here. Parthian horse archers, they are what they say they are. They're Parthian horse archers, literally no armor. Charge bonus of only 30, so I wouldn't even bother using these to charge the enemy in the back unless you have absolutely nothing else. But yeah, these guys with an ammunition of 15, they're going to be pretty helpful for the majority of the battle, but by the towards the end of it, they're going to have no ammunition and they're not going to be any good against enemy cavalry units. So I would be very hesitant to throw them into the mix against cav units. Basically just use these as a supporting unit to try and deal a little bit more damage to specific units that you want to get off the battlefield, such as a hoplite unit that's on its own. Run this unit around them, make them tired, bombard them with arrows. Moving on to that though,
We await your orders!
we have the Dahe Noble Cav, which is available to you from the early game. They are also a skirmisher slash archer cavalry unit, but they are also a shock cavalry unit, and they are a very good one. They have a charge bonus of 56. That's astounding. That's higher than the majority of cav for most other factions, and even the dedicated shock cavalry often don't reach that high. That's very, very good. Weapon damage of 30, missile damage of 17, which is quite good, especially for a cav unit. Melee attack of 13, very impressive. Melee defense of 5 though. You'll be seeing this theme throughout the majority of the cavalry for the Parthians. Generally you want their cav to charge in and charge back out, and that's very apparent here. Do not keep them in an extended melee. The only reason they won't die quickly if they get stuck in a melee is because they have a very impressive armor of 41. So yeah, use them however you like, but I generally would try to avoid keeping them. Extended melees use their archer fire to whittle down the enemy before you do get them stuck in a melee if you absolutely have to. But a very useful early game unit, but they are part of the elite class, which would be hard for you to recruit since they're low in population.
Horse archers!
Then we get to the bread and butter of the early tier skirmisher armies for Parthia, the Dahe Riders. Very basic, very low armor, but they are very much available to you, and that's a very big thing about the Parthian starting position. These cav units will be available to you in large numbers, so try to use them as much as you can. They do only have an ammunition of 5 though, which is pretty poor, but they do have a charge bonus of 40, so after they use their few javelins that they have, this is, wait, hang on, am I looking at the right one? Yes I am, but why do they have a range of 140? This is not a, oh no, it is a bow unit. Okay, they just have the spears in there, and I got confused. But yeah, ammunition of 5 still, that's pretty pathetic to be honest. It's very low. I'll be very careful about keeping them on fire at will. But they do have options available such as Cantabrian Circle, which can make them a little bit more useful, but generally I avoid that. I don't really find it to be all that helpful, to be honest. But yeah, weapon damage of 25, melee attack of 7, defense of 7. So this is a low tier unit that's going to be fairly versatile for you. Charge it into enemy infantry from the rear, support your other cavalry with it, and use numbers with this cav as much as you can. But do keep in mind it does not have a high attack, so don't expect it to win a battle for you without some help, or at least a lot of numbers on its side. Moving on though,
Swift and accurate!
to your other archer unit here, which is the Parthian Noble Horse Archers. Again, they kind of, well, this is actually the same unit that your general unit that I showed you earlier is, so I actually won't go into talking about that anymore. But just a reminder, very good shock cavalry for the early game, and they have very good missile damage of 18, which is actually very good for a archer unit on horseback. But moving on now,
Cataphracts!
despite these two units having the bow symbol on each unit, they're more so dedicated shock cavalry units. This is your Parthian Cataphract Horse Archer. This is where Parthia truly shows its colors in that it is a cataphract or heavy cavalry unit faction. It relies on its cataphracts to do a lot of the killing. And you're seeing here and that they have a missile damage of 18, which is excellent, and a range of 170, which is very good. That beats Cretan archers. Your heavy horses are going to be out shooting Cretan archers. Keep that in mind. That's quite impressive. Melee attack of 11, which is decent. Melee defense of 4 though. Defense is abysmal, despite this being a cataphract unit. Again, keep them in extended melee, they're going to be in trouble. Charge bonus of 54, better than most shock cavalry units of other factions, although not all of them. We will get to all of them shortly though. But yeah, quite a good shock cavalry dedicated unit. Just don't keep them stuck in combat.
Awaiting orders!
Over here though, we come to a signature Parthian unit, which is the Parthian camel cataphracts. These are very useful because of course camels scare horses. They are very heavily armored at 53. That is a very heavy armor. And you can see why. The camels themselves almost all have their own coats of armor on, in addition to their riders with heavy armor. Very impressive. This is just a skirmish unit though. They don't have bows. They actually use javelins,
Orders,
which is
my
different
lord!
compared to that last unit we were just looking at. So the missile damage will be quite high, but their range is pretty short and they only have an ammunition of 5. But they have a melee attack of 10, defense of 11, weapon damage of 19, but their charge bonus is 56. Very impressive, very useful, and they will actually not die in an extended melee unless they're going up against very specialized troops. Their heavy armor and overall pretty decent defense will actually keep them alive against other cav units that they go up against, and they'll probably even scare away other units as well since their camels go up against horses. So try to use these. I would say at least have 1, maybe 2 of these in your very good armies, especially once you go fighting up against Romans who you're going to have to kill their cavalry in order to win the battle.
Heavy cavalry.
Moving on though, we get to arguably the best single cataphract unit in the game. Parthian late cataphracts. This is a melee attack of 12, a melee defense of 12. So they're actually going to also survive melee for a while, which is good because they're your best cataphract unit. Charge bonus of 67. That's a massive jump. We go from, what was that?
Cataphracts!
56
Our orders!
to 67. That is a massive jump. And these guys are very, very impressive. They have an armor of 56 as well. Armor penetration of 12. Bonus versus infantry of 4. Base morale 49. The speed is a little bit low at 5. But far out, that charge bonus combined with the armor penetration. These guys are your Roman killers. They're going to be obliterating the Roman legionnaires. Even their most heavy infantry unit is going to suffer going up against these cataphracts. I would highly recommend you focus on charging enemies in the rear with this unit, but generally speaking, fantastic cataphract unit, if not the single best cataphract unit in the game, arguably. I've actually tried to do a little bit of research to see what cataphract units are better, and when I'm looking at a cataphract or a shock unit in general, I'm looking purely at their charge bonus. All of the other stats to me is secondary. Charge bonus is the number one thing for me for a cataphract unit, or for a shock cavalry unit in general. Besides not talking about chariots or elephants, of course, just strictly cavalry, I think this is the best cavalry unit in the entire game. They just have it all. They have good attack, good defense, insane armor, insane charge bonus. And from there, things go downhill, but not by much. We move on to the Nicean cavalry, which is another very heavy cavalry unit. One of the best in the game. Not the best because it does have lower stats than the last one we just discussed. But it has an insane charge bonus of 62. Very, 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 very impressive. Excellent. Armor of 49 as well. Melee defense of 12, attack of 9. These guys will survive if they get caught up against enemy cav units. 1-on-1, 2-on-1 they'll struggle, but they should still come out on top as long as they're not specialized units. They don't have the armor penetration that the other cataphract unit does though, and their weapon damage is at 26, which is quite good. But yeah, no armor pen really. Armor pen of 4 isn't really worth mentioning. They actually have a bonus versus cavalry of 3. So these guys will be crushing enemy infantry, and they'll be crushing enemy cavalry for the most part. Then we get to your Parthian noble cataphracts. They step up a little bit from that last unit in that they have better melee attack and defense at 11 and 10. Charge bonus of 63, again, very, very impressive. Armor of 51. Ooh, very impressive. Armor penetration of 11, bonus against infantry. These are shock cavalry dedicated to slaughtering Roman legionnaires, or basically any kind of heavy infantry unit. Very, very useful, but we're spending a lot of time talking about these cav units, so let's hurry it up and get going. Parthian cataphracts, they're basically the stage before that noble cataphract unit we just looked at. They still look very fantastic, as all of these units do. Charge bonus of 59, so it's slightly lower than the others, but again, excellent unit. Armor penetration of 11, bonus versus infantry 4. Again, these guys are heavy infantry killers, use them as such. In addition, they also have a melee defense of 8, so they will survive in a prolonged melee against other horse units, but be careful with that. 8's pretty low, so I would not keep them in melee if you can avoid it.
Sarmatian Royal Lancers.
We come to Sarmatian mercenary armored lancers. I kept this mercenary unit in because they're actually going to be quite common to you, since they're a little bit cheaper than some of these other very heavy cataphract units. And they also are still excellent. Charge bonus of 56, melee attack of 13, weapon damage of 30, but almost no armor penetration and almost no defense. So these guys will be charging medium to lightly equipped enemy troops in the field, and they'll be slaughtering them. Once you get to heavy though, that's when you're going to see them struggling, and they don't have any bonus against infantry or cavalry. So try to be careful in not letting them get tangled up in melee fights. But they do have a bow and a missile damage of 17, which is definitely nothing to scoff at. These guys can get some very nice sniping kills for you if needed.
Melee cavalry ready.
Now we move on to our very last unit in the game, and which I probably should have included with our other melee section, to be honest, because this unit is a bit of a dedicated melee infantry unit. I kept it up here though because it has such a high charge bonus of 45. Definitely not as high as the other shock cavalry units, but for a melee unit that is actually very good indeed. Melee attack of 9, defense of 11, weapon damage 26, and it has a bonus versus cavalry of 3 and a bonus versus infantry of 1. Very versatile unit. It can charge into the rear of enemy enemy infantry no problem, but can also charge head on into most enemy cav and wing you the day. So this unit here, I probably should have moved with this other melee dedicated unit over here.
Skirmisher cavalry.
Your median cav.
Heavy cavalry.
These are basically better. They're a slightly better version of the Roman equites, so use them accordingly. These are going to be cavalry killers for you, and they'll be very useful. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for looking at the Persian roster. They do have way more units available to them in the form of AOR units and mercenary units, so keep that in mind. They rule over a very multicultural area, so you have a lot of different variety in your troops. However, you're obviously lacking in the melee department. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in part 3 of our video, so let's get into it, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, before we jump into part 3 of this video, I just very quickly want to highlight to you the Parthian Navy, which is, again, unfortunately almost non-existent, which is quite surprising. I thought Parthia would have a better navy, but yeah, it just simply doesn't. Even the ship health of the generals is very low at 600. Very pathetic. I would avoid using a navy as Parthia at all costs. It's quite startling. I'm not sure if there's an issue with the custom battles perhaps as Parthia, but yeah, from what I'm seeing, it's just very terrible navy in general. Only slightly better than the Kate, even then it's arguably not better because the Kate have more health on their ships. So if you're playing as Parthia and say you own Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean and you're trying to keep Rome out, I would rely not on your navy, but instead on your cavalry to keep them at bay. Because as you see here, Rome has a lot of variety in their ships, and that's not including mercenaries or many AOR units. So yeah, Parthia is lacking severely in the naval department, although I guess it kind of makes sense since they didn't really do any naval fighting in the Mediterranean, since they rarely made it to the Mediterranean itself. So yeah, keep that in mind. Parthian navy does suck. But anyway, now we're going to move on to our part 3 verdict. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our part 3 of this video, the verdict for Parthia. Straight off the bat, to me, they are easily in the top 3 hardest factions for DEI in general. Whenever I hear Parthia being talked about on the forums and discords or whatever related to DEI, it's generally people asking for help as because they're such a difficult faction to get started with. In my opinion, they are a very high contender for having the hardest starting faction position of any faction. Very arguably the single hardest in the game, which is funny because they have such a unique and interesting roster and a very powerful roster to some extent. They do have some shortcomings though, but they can make up for them in the right scenario, which they are actually placed in. Once you develop your empire, you can make up for their shortcomings relatively easily. One of the main things about dealing with your early game though is that you will need to have a lot of things go right for you, in that you'll need the satrapies around you to not just go out and all out attack you for no reason, but you'll also need your war to go right in the north against the nomads, which I highly encourage you to pursue if the diplomacy is playing right in your favor. I recommend you check that out. Try to deal with your northern neighbors as quickly as you can. If you can't, then just instead focus on trying to develop friendly relations until you have your chance to fight against the satrapies of the Seleucids once they rebel. But you really need them to rebel. If they're not rebelling and you're attacking, good luck. In my opinion, it's kind of GG. So you need to be very patient in this campaign, which is a hard thing to do in Total War, especially when most people are used to just instantly declaring war on their neighbors and starting to paint the map in the way that they like. I just don't really see there being too many other options with that. I'm sure there is, but especially for the more skilled players. But yeah, I just highly recommend using patience as much as you can. One of the hardest early game starts, but it is one of the easiest in the late game, in my opinion. That's because once you formulate your own empire, like the Parthians did in real life, and they basically formed the Persian Empire again, there'll be very few factions that outclass you. None will outclass you in the cavalry department. And the main rival, Rome, has a very critical disadvantage against you. Against their cavalry is never going to be as good as yours. And they rely on your one advantage that you have, which is heavy infantry. What I mean by saying that is that Parthia is very good at dealing with enemy heavy infantry. That's your main advantage. That's where you will flourish. And the Romans have that in spades, and so you'll be able to micromanage your way around them. But they do have very micromanage heavy, intensive armies. You're really going to need to be on your ball game with your micromanagement, especially in the early game when your units don't have as much armor and therefore you don't have as much forgiveness or flexibility, I should say, in dealing with the enemy. Not only that, but you'll need to kind of micromanage your campaign in that you need to really time your choices correctly. You need to know when you're making the right decision to declare war. You don't want to do it too early, but you also don't want to do it too late, in that other factions are now more powerful than you or have alliances against you. So always double check on diplomacy before you start your campaigns and plan accordingly. But in my opinion, it's also one of the most rewarding campaigns you could possibly play on the map, or on the game in DI in general. You have a lot of difficult decisions to make. You'll need to make them from the early to mid game. Late game, it won't be as difficult to make decisions, but you still will need to be relatively careful. And I recommend you try to take your time playing as Parthia. Pause the game even, or don't rush in taking your turns, and just figure out what you want to do and how you're going to do it. It's a campaign where you need to play quite deliberately. It's not really like Rome or Carthage or Seleucids where you're playing a reactionary playstyle. Instead, you need to be very deliberate and plan out your moves and figure out what you're going to do accordingly. But yeah, they're a very challenging faction. Once you get into the late game though, your units become excellent, your economy becomes quite good, you get some bonuses to trade, so try to utilize that as much as you can. And your geography is actually quite helpful in the late game. The Romans are going to be going way out of their way to try and invade your lands. And they have a long journey to go. However, your lackluster navy does mean that they will be able to do so fairly easily, since they'll actually outclass you on the seas. So even though they have a very long way to go, their navy is better than yours. So perhaps try to rely more so on fighting the Romans on land than at sea. Which is funny because that's not something you hear every day, but that's probably true in this case. Your navy sucks. Don't rely on it to deal with the Romans. Instead, rely on your horses, which are just better in every single way, shape, and form. But coming to the end now, what rating am I going to give this? Before I tell you, I'm going to say I debated giving it a 9 because I think it's one of the single hardest factions to start off with. Like I said, you need a lot of things to go right in order for your campaign to be a success. But 9 to me is like extremely hard. 10 is it's almost impossible, and 8 is very hard. And I'm going with that. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. This is a very hard start, very hard campaign because of that start. And your mid tier will also be hard, but your late game should be quite easy, or at least around the normal difficulty level. I'm fairly confident giving it an 8. I'm curious to see what you guys would give for it. In my opinion, there's almost no faction that I would give a 9 or a 10 in DEI. 10 is like it's borderline impossible, and there isn't any factions that are impossible in my opinion. A 9, I don't know, it's kind of hard to justify fighting a 9 rating unless you're really new to DEI and you just don't know what you're doing. These ratings are dedicated to people who are average players at DEI, who know the basics, around the same level as me, and that they know plenty of general things, but they might not know all the specifics, and they might not be min-maxed type of players. Which I'm certainly not a min-maxer. I prefer a little bit of roleplay instead. But anyway, 8 out of 10. Very interesting faction. One of my most favorite to play as. I'm hoping to do a campaign on them eventually. But I'm fairly slow with my campaigns since it takes me such a long time to edit and record them due to how I do a narrator style. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, let me know your thoughts down below. Do you agree or disagree with my verdict? Is there anything that I missed? Do you think I should highlight in the comments, or perhaps make an addendum to, or just tell me? I always welcome any feedback. I'm human and make some mistakes, as I'm sure some of you have seen in my latest videos. But anyway, I really enjoy making these faction overviews. I hope you guys are enjoying them, so please leave any suggestions you have down below. But beyond that, thank you all for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I shall see you in the next one.